bringing in wisdom with what we talk about. We are not just teaching, like standing in front of a class and lecturing. This is what you're going to see, and this is, how we do it. We're bringing in wisdom with this podcast. We're bringing in experience. We're bringing in reflections of what we've done well, what we haven't done well. Janet, I loved your transparency on your story that you shared earlier. That's what this podcast is about. So I think our conversation was great.
Do you remember that old joke, 3 calm disc professionals walk into a bar and, oh, wait, you've never heard it before? We haven't either. But what if 3 calm disc professionals did walk into a bar, sit down at a table, and have thoughtful conversations about a whole host of topics? What if you could eavesdrop and maybe even pull up your own chair? And what if that bar was actually a coffee shop because at least one of us would inevitably fall asleep or want to dance after a couple glasses of wine? This series is that conversation in the coffee shop where you get to listen in on thoughtful discussions about a variety of topics from the perspective of a medical SLP, a school-based SLP, and a professor in communication sciences and disorders. Grab a drink, pull up a chair, and let's get started.
Ready to talk about discharges?
I think so. This one's
Frankly, this is the episode I'm most nervous about.
I know. I'm a little nervous too.
Hi.
This is exactly how this whole episode's going to go. We're going to start, stop, I'm not sure. And isn't that the nature of discharge and dismissal from service? Start, stop, I'm not sure. So it's weird that this is the one I'm most nervous about, but this is the one that I am most nervous about. And I would love it if somebody had an idea why. Maybe we'll get there in the conversation.
I was also thinking about we have tucked in there things about yourself, like how do you know when it's time to change jobs, or maybe you move, normal feelings about change. And so I think there's a piece of it that it's like, whoa, this gets kind of personal here.
Yeah.
Oh, that's right. Because I do recall Maddie saying, let's talk about letting go, not just in the context of a client-therapist relationship. Mm-hmm. No wonder I feel so freaked out about this episode.
You ought to.
I cannot be the only one that tears up when she says goodbye to people.
You're not.
No, you're not.
We're going to feel feelings in this one. Is that what you're telling me?
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
dear. And that's what makes us.
Okay.
That's what makes us who we are.
I feel like this is pointing me to maybe why I've chosen the structure of my life and job. I went for career counseling before I went back for my PhD. And the person that, I don't remember everything from the counseling, but one of the things that he said was, you like to mix things up every 5 to 7 years. So now I'm 30 years out from my master's program. And I look back and that has absolutely been my history, whether it's because of a move or because I did different training or switched institutions. So there's that. And then I think even in higher ed, there's a bit of this, like every semester, there's some closure and some like moving on. And so we're continually, I don't know, maybe saying goodbye for the semester, or it's a transition to a new student with that client, or maybe you're passing off that client to a colleague. So I haven't had a lot of like terminal goodbyes, if you will. I've done more like, hey, this was fun. See you around.
It's so different than the medical setting.
I think that's interesting, Janet, because as you were talking, I felt like you were saying, I like to shift. I like to pass it off versus saying goodbye.
I think so. Yeah.
Wow, interesting. And Maddie, you said that is so different in the medical setting. Talk more about what you mean by that. Like what comes to mind?
Well, in the medical setting, we say goodbye to patients because they die. And We say goodbye to them because they decline. We don't get breaks at the end of the semester. We don't get breaks in the summertime. It's week in, week out. And a patient will come in, we'll do our intake, for example, in the outpatient clinic, and we'll stay with that patient or the adult or the kiddo until we sometimes will transfer to another provider if they're more skilled in a service than us. But most of the time, we're hard. I've got this, I've worked with these little kiddos sometimes, and here I say I'm not as keen on kids, but I just have such a heart for them, where they work so hard. We work so hard, and then we discharge, and I'm just like, fly, little bird, fly. I wish I could stalk you on social media because I want to see where you're going to go, because I know you're going to go do great things. But our goodbyes are, we hold on to them maybe longer in the medical setting because we don't have those naturally articulated endings. Just different dynamic.
I think what's interesting in the school setting is that you do have those structures and those seasons. And goodness, I have a graduation ceremony to round out my time with kids, right? And yet, sometimes that is really exciting. Sometimes there's this nervous trepidation. Sometimes I just feel sad. Not because, I'm not excited for the student, but boy, you can't do this job without really having these connections. Right. And then you know that no matter what, in 4 years, they're out of here. And I don't know, it is kind of a different experience because we do have those very clear beginning, middle, and ending points with how our time is structured with students in a school setting.
Very true. So let's take a step back then and talk a little bit about how we, in our different settings, decide when to discharge, and cover some of those topics, like what do you do when they haven't progressed towards their goals, or you have a caregiver who's not on board. What are your thoughts on that?
I think part of my responsibility is to sometimes name what we know is happening. And I think plateaus can feel really uncomfortable to talk about, but they happen. And when I think about part of my professional responsibility, I think about the ASHA Code of Ethics, and what I kind of kick around is that notion of are you providing therapy past the point where it's going to make some sort of meaningful difference? And that has to be part of what guides some of those difficult conversations. Mm-hmm. The professional ethics around keeping someone on a caseload and keeping somebody in service just because a guardian wants it, or you feel uncomfortable with having the conversation around changing. And I think those are both reasons sometimes an individual may stay on caseload past the point that they probably should. I think sometimes you have pressure to keep someone in intervention in the school setting past the point where you probably should from external sources. So I can talk about the ASHA Code of Ethics, but I also have administrators and directors and teachers and other people that are kind of weighing into that conversation. Mm-hmm. So those are difficult conversations to have, but they're necessary. And I do think that is part of our professional obligation. So when you talk about the situation of how do you know when to let go because there's maybe a lack of progress, be really solid in your evidence, in your data across sessions and over time. And to the extent that you can say, in X out of X sessions, here's what happened. That's also true if you have somebody who really needs it and doesn't show up for a long time, across time, when you've tried lots of different things. Now, I'm not talking about the kid that's just having a bad day. But if you've come at things for a year and a half in lots of different ways, you handed over control of that scheduling, tried lots of different things, maybe a more difficult conversation has to occur around what's working and what's not working.
I was, some districts, I do some consulting with school districts, and some school districts are starting to be more overt about what are dismissal criteria, because there has historically been a tendency for a child to be in the system and continue until they graduate, or somebody decides that they're not going to have services again. And so I think that's challenging, but I think it's really important. And one of the districts that I worked with, I think it actually was yours, Katie, there was a team that was deciding what would be appropriate criteria for dismissal. And is that something we can talk about during an IEP meeting? So on the front end, your child is qualifying. These are the services. Here would be some reasons when services would be finished up. And I really like that transparency, just so that it doesn't become an individual SLP having to kind of make the case whether the child should or shouldn't continue.
Yeah, I was a part of that team that really advocated for having some clarity around what are the drivers, what are the conversations, what are the considerations we think about with dismissal, and the idea that we might have those conversations sooner rather than later, because any therapy is intended to be temporary.
Right.
Where it gets muddy in the schools is there's also this kind of narrative. I don't know where it came from exactly, but there's a narrative that if someone has a disability, they always have a disability. I am not saying that that is coming from me. I'm not saying that I agree with that, but they use the language of disability. And there's kind of this informal representation that once that's there, it will always be. But we're therapists, and we come out of that notion of, here's this thing. We just talked in the last session about how we feel like we got to work on this. We got to make this better. We got to get this to where this person doesn't need me anymore. So the notion of having some clarity around dismissal, I think, is helpful for us, particularly in a school setting. And I'm curious to know if this is true in a medical setting as well, Maddie. But I think in the school setting, it can sometimes be a little muddy because we have a lot of appeals to us for what is nice versus what is necessary. And we are talking about the necessity of a skilled service, not the awesomeness of being able to keep that skilled service.
Go ahead, Janet.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to comment on the when you said the person has a disability. And I just wanted to add to that, sort of not in an identity first way, right? Not in a, like, I'm an autistic individual, more in a, like, this person has a disability and stuff that continues to need to be fixed, right? Is that what you're
correct?
thinking?
And I think what's interesting about that, if that is the mindset that's kind of cultivated in a special education setting, again, whether intended or not, you kind of create a situation where kids can languish on a caseload. Because what we're saying is no matter what you do, it doesn't go away if it's a disability. And what I'm suggesting is, particularly in the areas in which we work and the notion of therapy, I think it can. I think it does. We do have students who are dismissed from special education services. That happens too. So there are sometimes ways things are represented that I don't know if they're necessarily really helpful when we consider this notion that ultimately our overarching goal is to make ourselves unnecessary to whomever we are serving. Right?
Right. If we juxtapose that against the medical setting, the treatment span is much shorter. I can often cover a patient in intensive care, and when I go in the next day, they're gone. When I worked at the big university hospitals, different patients every day sometimes. I was lucky if I got them 2 or 3 days in a row. When their intensive care is done, they move to the acute floor. When they're done, their stay is done, they might move to transitional care. When their transitional care is done, they move to home health. Then home health, they come back as an outpatient. And very seldom is that the same speech language pathologist involved in all of those settings. Unless you're in a very rural medical setting, you're going to have a different speech pathologist in all of those different settings. And the driving factor there, unfortunately, is the medical insurance, and qualifying, inserting, and reserting, and getting that patient. So stays are much, much, much shorter, and you know that they're going to be shorter, and that you're already, that that fuse is already lit, and the time is already ticking.
I was just thinking about medical insurance and how much that comes into play, and what does that feel like to you? Or maybe are there patient examples where you can kind of, where you either felt like, oh, that was really a good way to let me, dismiss, or that was a way where I just feel like this wasn't serving the patient?
That's a very good question. And that has changed over the years. When I first started, it was a much more patient-centered. We would evaluate a patient and then carry them until they truly were ready to be discharged. And now the discharge requirements are so much out of our control. And we have to search for 8 visits or 12 visits or 4 visits. And then at the end of those visits, we have to go back and resert. Often I will ask for way more than I need. And then if I'm done, great, I'm done, and we discharge early, because it's easier to ask at the beginning than to go back and say, oh, we need more. So I feel, and I guess maybe this is why I've learned to be so effective, is I've got to get in there, and I've got that evaluation time. I have 60 minutes to get that evaluation done. I do the quick bonding that I can in the moment, sit down in the guest of honor. Why are you here? Let them tell me in their own words, do the evaluation, get their feedback on what they would like to work on in therapy, and then wrap up that evaluation. And then the next session is goals. And so we move along pretty quickly. I wish we had more time, but because of that, I'm effective, and I'm engaging, and I'm pulling those patients in with me. But it's definitely changed over the years, Janet.
I was just going to say, Maddie, I know some of your materials on your Fresh SLP pod website. I can't talk. On your Fresh SLP website really reflect, I think, that kind of tight thinking, clear organization. I mean, that really comes through as a strength in the way that you present your materials, and I'm sure the way your clinical practice plays out.
Thank you. You have to be effective and efficient.
And I am a fan of that notion of effectiveness, efficiency, and urgency. When I was hearing you speak, Maddie, the word that kept coming to my mind was some urgency around why this and not that. What am I going to focus on? How am I designing this intervention? Because I know I've only got 12 visits that have been approved. I've got to make the most of those 12 visits. And what I think is interesting is that I have a similar feeling of urgency, I think, because I work in a high school, and I perceive that it's the last 4 years. It's the end of the road. And it's not that some of my students don't go on to post-secondary programming in a public education setting, but that is not a given. And I would not ever want to orient to students in that way. What I think can sometimes happen, and what I would be curious to hear about from some of our colleagues who work in an elementary setting, or even in early childhood, does that create a similar sense of urgency and need for efficiency? Or because you're thinking, this little person's got 13 years. Is that not as much of a driver or a feeling? And I know we maybe can't answer that here, but I'd be curious. Janet, you worked with little people. Mm-hmm. Do you have some thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think a few things are kind of going through my head. I think at an early stage, maybe say under 5, there often can be the developmental expectations are front and center. So I think you're looking at, is it likely, or how do I help this child catch up with the developmental expectations? And then it seems like, in my experience, around that time where they're starting more formal school, like kindergarten-ish level, then it seems like you're starting to be thinking about, is this a long-term part of the support system for this child and this family? And so that kind of changes the equation a little bit. Also, I think, particularly with language development, there's this transition when you're moving from primarily oral language, spoken and comprehension, to print-based language of reading and writing. There's sort of a who does what, and in what way is the speech and language person involved as part of the support system, and in what way is someone else, maybe the reading specialist or someone else. Another thought that was kind of running through my head was just the trickiness sometimes if you and the caregiver don't see eye to eye on dismissal. And I feel like the more common scenario is the SLP is saying it's time for dismissal and the caregiver would like to continue. Yeah. So have you had experiences with that?
I'm sure you have, Katie. I was just going to say, I'd like to take just a step backwards for a second. One of the beautiful things about our profession is we all get to choose where we want to work and with who we want to work with. And so I enjoy the intensity of an intensive care unit. The more challenging, bring it on. I love it. Video swallow studies, oh my gosh. Those are puzzles for me, you know? I know, Janice, like, no.
I'm holding up a no sign.
I like that intensity. And I remember when I was in grad school, I worked for a Scottish Rite Center out in Washington State, and much more laid back setting. So these are some things that as speech pathologists move through their careers, we get to pick and choose how we feel and where we want to work. But Katie, good question posed by Janet. What do you do? Have you had situations where you've been ready to discharge and a family member hasn't been?
I have, and I do kind of help families start to think about it a little bit differently and help them understand the role of a therapy and how it's different from instruction in a course. I'm a student in a class and I'm taking a science class. I'm taking that class from the beginning, the middle, through the middle to the end. And there is a set amount of time. And so I think what can sometimes happen, especially in the setting that I work in, is sometimes parents and guardians can start to get a little nervous. They can get a little panicky, like, I don't want this thing that my child has done and had experiences with, and that I think has helped my child to end, because what does that mean? So I think a lot of times that is kind of from this place of uncertainty and maybe even a little bit of fear. And so I try to help families understand that if we're talking about dismissal, that a lot of times is a really, really good thing, because what that means is that your child is showing me they don't need me anymore. And how cool is that? Because I'll always say to kids, I can't live in your basement or the backseat of your car anyway. So I love that you're making this happen. And I think sometimes you have to kind of help parents see it that way too, because the first response is, this is something that is being lost. This is something that is being taken away. And so helping them understand that the reason this is being changed is because your kid's knocking it out of the park. Now, some of you listening right now are saying, but wait a second, Katie, you just said there are kids that plateau and there are kids that get stuck. And that's true too. And in the situation, particularly when I'm working in a high school, I will say, your child is communicating with us. And when I send a pass and I go to find him or her, they're communicating their needs as best they can in this situation too. And at some point, we have to talk about if we're going to honor that as well. Because your child's making it really, really clear to me that this is not something that they want to do right now. And as an adult, and they're closer to being an adult than they are a kid, as an adult, they get to choose if they participate in lots of different things. But when it's a therapy, some buy-in is required. And right now, that buy-in isn't there. And then I'll tell families, I'm not saying it won't show up again. You know, if a year from now, this becomes something that is important to fill in the student's name here, let's circle back and talk about it again. But right now, communication is still happening. And let's look at what's being communicated. So that's the hard time, but also really important to what we do.
Absolutely. And that is very important. So, that answers the question of how do you say goodbye when a person has met their goals. You wish them well, goodbye, good luck, keep in touch. But those harder ones are when they don't. Like in my world, it would be a Parkinson's patient who we know is going to get quieter and quieter, or ALS, or a stroke where you've taken them as like primary progressive aphasia. I'm thinking of all the primary, the progressive ones, but the ones where you haven't achieved your goals, those are the harder ones to say goodbye to.
So Maddie, what might you say in some of those situations? Like when you're having that conversation with a patient and families, what could that sound like?
I would honor what they've given me and the work that we have done together. And I would thank them for working so hard with me. And I would acknowledge the accomplishments that they have made. I would remind them of what we have targeted in therapy. I'm a big bridger, how to bridge what we've learned and take it home. And then I would let go. You have to let go. You have to let go.
I want to just lift out a couple themes of that you were saying. I mean, I think, Katie, you said something about often there's this strong feeling of loss from the family. Like I'm losing something that's been a very positive support. And then Maddie, you said something really about bridging. And I think that's a really good package, right? So there's the loss bit, and then explaining, like you said, the good thing or the achievements. And like Maddie was saying, kind of like, well, what does this look like now? Where is that support coming from? How do you continue to foster communication, successful swallowing, confidence, whatever it is that's the sort of functional target. I was thinking about one of my favorite ages of clients are young adults who are often they're young adults who are in college. And so maybe they have had some experiences previously and just thought, well, I'm done. I didn't stop my speech in middle school because it wasn't helping. But now they're a young adult. They're really taking some more ownership of their lives and they're ready to come on back. So I think just that acknowledgement that the door isn't permanently shut, you can still crack it open or it's unlocked, come back.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I know, ladies, we were going to talk about also transitioning and saying goodbye and moving in our careers, but I would love to save that part of this discussion for a whole nother episode.
Okay.
Unpack, because the three of us have had amazing careers in our own settings. Mm-hmm. Any final thoughts then on discharging, letting go of the people we work with?
I guess I just want to normalize some of the mixed feelings that you may have. I mean, I think there may be some second guessing yourself or, both excitement, but also a little bit of that sense of loss or grief within yourself as a therapist. And I think, Katie, I love the way you frame things where you're like, just notice that, right? Just notice that. You don't have to change it or push it away. Just observe that that's part of what you're feeling. And that's okay. That's absolutely normal.
And I would say observe it and try to be gentle with yourself about it. I think a caution would be in noticing that kind of mixed experience of feelings around dismissal, whether it was the most successful therapeutic intervention situation you've experienced, or maybe things didn't go the way you'd hoped, or maybe you ran out of sessions, or maybe that student moved, or maybe that patient is at a place in terms of their primary progressive disease process where that letting go is painful, because there is going to be a terminal experience associated with that individual's life. And you know that. But I think acknowledging that mixed bag of emotions without judging it. I would caution you to see it, observe it, let those feelings sit with you at the table, but try really hard to stay away from, well, if maybe you had, or you should have, or I wonder if you would have.
Yep.
When you start to feel your mind head into those places, take a breath, say, I'm just going to see this for what it is. And what it is part of what we do. And it's okay that I have lots of feelings happening. There's room for it all.
I love that. That self-compassion. I've heard two things that are sticking in my head, and I try to rally in when I see my inner critic kind of like amplifying the voice. One is, what would I say to someone else in that situation? Because usually I can extend a lot more grace to someone else. And then the second one that I've heard is, picture someone who cares deeply about me saying those words or extending that compassion. If I can't quite get myself to extend it, sometimes of those methods, I can get there.
I love our wisdom. I love what we're bringing. I love what we're sharing. I love what we're giving.
It's a journey, still learning.
Well, a very wise SLP that I know reminded me about the importance of milestones. And I had forgotten to mark my journey with milestones in life. I must have been at the point in my life where I was so busy, and COVID had hit, and graduation was coming, and she said, nope, we're going to stop, we're going to pause, and we're going to celebrate this milestone that we're at. And that is a lesson that I will carry with me for a long time. And that's remembering that we are indeed on a journey, and it's not a race to the end. And with our patients, it's not a race. With our careers, it's not a race. With our relationships we have, it's not a race. But it's enjoying those little moments when we do have that kiddo who thinks we're like better than Santa Claus, or when we do have those moments of success. And that's the milestones that we need to celebrate. That prevents us from it protects us from some of the burnout and the exhaustion that we sometimes are pressed into because of who we are. So our next episode is episode 5. So exciting. The time machine. If you could go back in time, what advanced insights or support would you offer to that newly minted SLP? We have something exciting happening at ASHA. I've ordered little bags of branded popcorn, and each little bag is going to have a CR code on it that's going to take you directly to the SLP advice hotline. And people are going to call and hopefully give us advice for our 5th episode. So, remember, I'm old enough. I know you guys are my age too. So you guys remember Dear Abby? It's not going to be Dear Maddie. but it's going to be the SLP advice column. So episode 5 is our next one, and we're just going to take lots of questions from you guys on tips and tricks of being a successful speech language pathologist. Goosebumps again, ladies, my fishbowl friends.
Yes, thank you so much for the conversation.
Thank you. This was really wonderful.
I hope today's conversation has created some aha moments for you and motivated you to become a better SLP, continuing to connect some of those missing links between what you know and how to use that knowledge. Thank you for downloading the Missing Link for SLPs podcast. And if you enjoyed the show, I'd love you to subscribe, rate it, and leave a short review. Also, please share an episode with a friend. Together we can raise awareness and help more SLPs find and connect those missing links and get the information needed to help them feel confident in their patient care every step of the way. Follow me on Instagram and join the Fresh SLP community on Facebook. Show notes are always available, so come learn more at freshslp.com. Let's make those connections. You got this.